This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it's Wednesday, which means it's time for another MTG deck history video. In this series, I look at the history of deck archetypes that have been successful at Magic's highest level of competition, starting from the first time a particular deck emerged and ending with the modern day. As usual, I ran a poll that let you, the viewers, decide the topic of this video, and this time around, Caw-Blade emerged victorious. Caw-Blade refers specifically to a standard deck that emerged in 2011. These were mid-range decks that sought to outcard the opponent in a variety of ways, with two of the most notable ways being with Squadron Hawk and Stoneforge Mystic. The Hawk is where the Caw part of the name comes from, while the Blade part comes from Stoneforge Mystic's ability to search up equipment, including swords. Caw-Blade was one of the most dominant decks Standard has ever seen. In addition to Caw-Blade, I'm also going to take a look at decks in other formats with similar strategies that no longer go by the Caw-Blade name, mostly because the Hawk is no longer part of the deck. These Hawkless decks usually go by the name Stoneblade. At one time or another, Stoneblade decks have found success in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and in this video, we'll talk about both the origins of Caw-Blade and Stoneblade, as well as how they've changed over time. While a deck called Caw-Blade didn't top 8 an event before 2011, the origins of Caw-Blade do date back earlier, to 2010. At Worlds that year, Brian Kibler piloted a deck he called Caw-Go. He didn't end up top 8ing the event, but that was because his performance in other formats wasn't enough to get him there. His standard deck was undefeated on day 1 of Worlds and finished with an overall great record. Kibler's deck was a blue-white control deck that derived its name from the Squadron Hawk and the Draw-Go strategy of control decks, meaning that if you were playing the deck, your turn often consisted of drawing a card and saying, "Go," because you plan on doing stuff on your opponent's turn. The Hawks provided important card advantage and could even serve as a win condition, though the deck was more reliant on getting there with its powerful planeswalkers. In 2011, several new cards were printed that led to this deck changing. At Pro Tour Paris in 2011, 4 of the top 8 decks went by the name of Mystic Caw-Go. The new Caw variant ran more creatures than Kibler did. In particular, this deck added the Stoneforge Mystic to the mix, which is where the Mystic part of the name comes from. The Mystic, like Squadron Hawk, provided important card advantage, and it was great that it could search up a super powerful equipment, like Sword of Feast and Famine, or a great situational piece of equipment, like Sylvok Lifestaff. This version of Caw-Go was really the link between Kibler's Caw-Go and the full arrival of Caw-Blade later in 2011. At Grand Prix Dallas that year, 4 of the top 8 decks went by the name Caw-Blade. This version of the deck was not drastically different from Mystic Caw-Go, but you can see that the deck goes a little deeper on creatures with the inclusion of a Myria Angel, a creature that can spit out flying creature tokens, and it also runs Mortar Pod, a good piece of equipment to search up in many situations. You could use it to help you do lethal, or to pick off small creatures. Then, by June of 2011, a deck that was already really good became even better. At Grand Prix Singapore, 4 Caw-Blade decks made the top 8. These decks were made better by new Phyrexia, which introduced both Batterskull and Sword of War and Peace. These 2 cards really powered up Stoneforge Mystic especially. When you played one, you now had an option between 2 very powerful swords and the living weapon equipment Batterskull, which you could put into play on turn 3 with the Mystic. Before these 2 new equipment became available, Stoneforge Mystic decks really only had a single equipment that was incredibly powerful, Sword of Feast and Famine. Now, they had 3. Meanwhile, the Squadron Hawks were excellent at carrying the swords. The change of these 2 singleton cards might not seem like a big deal, but these 2 cards made Stoneforge Mystic decks so much better. And remember, all of this isn't just that you're getting these strong cards, it's that you're getting them and you have card advantage, as your 2-mana 1/2 effectively draws you whatever is the best card in your deck, and then it can even help you put it into play more cheaply. It's worth noting too that 2 of the other top 8 decks at Grand Prix Singapore were Darkblade decks, which pretty much had the same strategy but ran black. In other words, 6 of the top 8 decks at Grand Prix Singapore were Squadron Hawk and Stoneforge Mystic decks. This was becoming a serious problem, as those decks just crushed all of the opposition, and Standard was becoming especially homogeneous. So after Grand Prix Singapore, both Jace the Mind Sculptor and Stoneforge Mystic were banned in Standard. This mostly meant the end for legitimate Caw-Blade decks, but some decks with similar strategies did continue to use that name. For example, Yuya Watanabe top-8 Grand Prix Pittsburgh in 2011 with a post-ban Caw-Blade deck. It was still a blue-white deck, but it went a little more mid-rangey, running several more creatures. It still ran Swords and Squadron Hawk, so the name still made sense, but as you can see, the deck is significantly powered down without the powerful Planeswalker and Stoneforge Mystic. Caw-Blade decks continue to find success in Standard, albeit as a shell of their former selves, throughout 2011 and into early 2012 before disappearing from Standard forever. Some key cards rotated out, including Squadron Hawk and Gideon Jura. However, this wasn't the end for this type of deck. Stoneforge Mystic went unbanned in Legacy, and it was able to find significant success there pretty quickly in decks that came to be known as Stoneblade. Let's move now to that format, which is where Stoneforge Mystic decks have enjoyed the most consistent success over the years. The first person to top-8 a Legacy Premier event with Stoneblade was Pierre Somen, who did it at Grand Prix Amsterdam in 2011 with a Bant deck. Obviously enough, Legacy has a much larger card pool, so the deck does differ in some key ways. For one thing, Squadron Hawk just doesn't really cut it in the Eternal formats, and that's why the Caw part of the name fell by the wayside. However, the deck is still a blue-white deck that looks to abuse Stoneforge Mystic and Jace the Mind Sculptor. However, it does run more creatures, leaning more in an aggro control direction. The deck still runs a Sword and a Batterskull, but there's also Umezawa's Jite, an additional incredibly powerful equipment that wasn't in Standard. It came with a slew of modal effects that could really take over the game. So now, the deck had access to 3 different equipments that can just end games. The deck also runs a significantly different suite of creatures, apart from the Stoneforge Mystic, of course. The creatures who could really win the game for you in this case are Knight of the Reliquary, who gets massive in a hurry, can really fix your mana and search up utility lands, and Vendilion Click, who has flying, making it effectively wield the deck's equipment while also disrupting the opponent with its Enter the Battlefield effect. Obviously, the deck also had access to way better counter magic, removal, and card draw, and it takes advantage of that too. In 2011 and 2012, Stoneblade decks didn't vary a whole lot from one to another, other than that most other Stoneblade decks didn't run green, and thus that means no Knight of the Reliquary. As you can see with Adam Yurchik's blue-white deck, which top-8 Grand Prix Indianapolis, the deck went in a more controlling direction later on. His decided to go with more counter magic and Snapcaster mages, and add another Planeswalker in Elspeth Knight Errant. Elspeth could sort of fill the Squadron Hawk role in that it could give you several small bodies to put equipment on, and in addition to that, she could also send creatures into the air. There was also an Esper variant, such as Tom Martell's, which won the same Grand Prix. Black is added to the mix here to gain access to the newly printed Lingering Souls, which is pretty much a better version of Squadron Hawk in the sense that it's one card that gives you several evasive bodies, and that's pretty great for your equipment. It also means the deck didn't have to run very many creatures. Black also gave the deck access to disruptive discard spells, which was no small thing either. However, later in 2012, Stoneblade decks would change significantly. This was largely the result of some new cards, in particular Delver of Secrets and Geist of St. Traft. The deck became spell-heavy enough that it could easily flip the Delver, making it effectively a 1-mana 3/2 with flying, which also happens to be a good creature to equip a Sword or Jite to. It also added Geist of St. Traft, a great creature to equip because of hexproof, and also because it always brought a 4/4 flyer into combat with it. Not all versions of Stoneblade going forward ran these two cards. By 2013, the deck had shifted back into Esper, with Lingering Souls once again playing a very prominent role. For most of the deck's history in Legacy, there really wasn't a huge amount of change, other than the different creatures that came in and out of the deck over the years. Stoneblade would undergo its next meaningful change in late 2013 as a result of 2 new creatures, Baleful Strix and True Name Nemesis. The Strix provided card advantage to go along with an evasive Death Touch body, and the Nemesis was incredibly difficult to interact with, which once again means it's a great place to put equipment. The Strix didn't become something that was always played in later Stoneblade decks, but True Name Nemesis did, and it would be a while before the deck underwent any other significant changes. However, starting in 2017, some other versions of the deck went 4 colors so that they could play Leovold, another creature that makes sure you always come out ahead with card advantage. Even if we fast forward all the way to the modern day, you can see how little Legacy Stoneblade decks have changed. There are some new cards in the deck, like a Singleton Brazen Borrower, along with the old standbys like the Mystic Vendilion Click and True Name Nemesis. The deck also makes use of some other newer cards, like Narset Parter of Veil, Shark Typhoon, and Teferi Time Raveler, but the deck's core strategy and its plan pretty much remain the same. Play efficient threats that you can get card advantage out of and equip them with stuff you search up, or just play a Batterskull. That does it for our discussion of Legacy Stoneblade, but Stoneblade decks have found some success in other formats such as Modern. You might be wondering why it took all the way until 2019 for there to be a Stoneforge Mystic deck in Modern, and the answer is that the Mystic was one of the cards that was preemptively banned in 2011 when the Modern format was created. At the time, it had caused way too many problems in Standard, and they didn't want the same thing to happen in Modern, where there was even more powerful equipment to search up. However, after 8 years in exile, the Mystic was unbanned in 2019, and, unsurprisingly, it spawned a Modern Stoneblade variant. About a month after the unbanning, the first Stoneblade decks got their first top 8s in Modern at Magic Fest Indianapolis. You can see from Joseph Bernal's deck that his is very similar to the more controlling Legacy version of the deck, with many of the same creatures, planeswalkers, and equipment. The biggest difference in the deck is in its control elements, because there just aren't as powerful of removal and counterspells in Modern. It is also worth noting that Jace the Mind Sculptor had been unbanned in 2018, giving Modern Stoneblade complete access to one of the key 1-2 punches that powered the deck in other formats. However, the other deck to top 8 at Magic Fest Indianapolis was significantly different from what we've seen so far. It went Jeskai and leaned more in the direction of aggression, packing in Geist, Snapcaster, and Stoneforge Mystic, as well as Giver of Runes and Spell Queller. The Giver provides much needed protection and evasion, and the Queller gives you a way to add to the board while also dealing with an opposing spell, which is pretty great. The reason the deck ran red was to play burn spells too, both Lightning Helix and Lightning Bolt, and that tells you something about the strategy of this particular Stoneblade deck. Stoneblade decks, overall, haven't found a ton of success in Modern outside of 2019. Stoneforge Mystic decks in general have still been pretty good, but they ended up going in different directions, such as Hate Bear and Snow Control. There's still one more format to look at though, and that's Vintage. As you can see though, even in Vintage, the deck didn't really change drastically. Of course, there's access to the Power 9 and more powerful counter magic, but the deck still uses the same kind of creatures and equipment that we've already seen time and time again. Stoneblade isn't really a consistent thing in Vintage though. So that pretty much does it for the history of both Caw-Blade and Stoneblade. It was a dominant Standard deck, has been a consistent player in Legacy since 2011, and has shown flashes of greatness in both Modern and Vintage. Well, that does it for this deck history. If you want to have a say in next week's topic, don't forget to vote in the poll on the community tab. If you want to make sure you stay aware of future episodes in this series, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Also, if you want to catch up on the 14+ other episodes in the series, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.